Thank you so much. Greetings, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being early, being on time. Greetings. Welcome. Thank you so much. My name is Wendy Bravo. I am the manager for Decolonize You at Honor the Earth. I am a detribalized, reconnecting, and reclaiming relative. My pronouns are she, hers, hers, she, her, and hers. We're excited and honored that you're joining us today. I'd also like to introduce my amazing team representing IT. We have Anna. She'll be available as you need for any audio, visual, tech wrinkles that you need in the chat. We also have our wonderful comms team representing here, Lala. She does our socials and makes everything look beautiful and communication wise with our lovely relatives and community. So thank you both for being here and supporting with this webinar. As this is the second training in our program, I'd like to introduce Honor the Earth and Decolonize You. Honor the Earth's vision is creating a world where Indigenous sovereignty is recognized, respected, and upheld. We envision a future where communities thrive with honor, abundance, and in right relationship with Mother Earth. Our mission is a commitment to protecting the lifeways and sovereignty of our Indigenous relatives across Mother Earth. We do this by investing in our communities and a new generation of organizers through campaigns, research, training, reclaiming our narrative, and providing capacity support and service of all land and life. Decolonize You is a knowledge sharing platform to provide skills and learning in the fight for climate justice and the protection of Mother Earth. We know that Indigenous peoples hold the solutions to climate change. Decolonize You is a platform to weave those solutions together, bring them to our communities, and organize for our collective liberation. We envision a place where education is a weapon in our fight for Indigenous sovereignty. To that end, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Asher BlackDeer. Dr. BlackDeer is a queer anti-colonial scholar activist from the Southern Cheyenne Nation. Her scholarship illuminates the impact of structural violence on American Indian and Alaska Native communities. Dr. BlackDeer centers Indigenous voices throughout her research by using quantitative approaches and big data as tools for responsible storytelling. Dr. BlackDeer is a racial equity scholar with an emphasis on Indigenous tribal sovereignty and is deeply committed to furthering anti-colonial abolitionist work. Please help me welcome Dr. BlackDeer.
Yay! Thank you so much.
Hit
Happy
it.
Wona. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here today. Um, so I always have my little intro slide because my elders are always like, before you just start telling people what you know, tell people who you are, right? So introductions, I so appreciate them. I always have to say too, like, Happy Wona, good morning, Tono Nedon Shive. My name is Asher BlackDeer. I'm from the Southern Cheyenne Nation. This word here is Nasistas, which is our way of saying I am Cheyenne or we are Cheyenne people. And yeah, I'm so excited to share space with y'all today. We're going to be talking about, we've already done introductions. This is our agenda setting now. We're going to start out with looking at some core concepts of gender and sexuality, just to kind of give us the language to really orient ourselves to what we're discussing, right? To give us all some kind of key terms to ground ourselves. From there, we're going to look at the colonial impact of Indigenous expression, right? And how colonialism has interrupted our traditional ways of, expressing genders and sexualities. And then we'll kind of go towards looking at future avenues, emerging language that folks are using, movements that we can support, and those sorts of things to kind of be better relatives as we go forward. And then at the end, we'll have time for discussion. And so we will give you more instructions on that when we get to that portion, okay? And so you can always use the chat throughout our time together. There's also a Q&A button. So for Q&A at the end, for our discussion time, you're welcome to place questions there throughout the talk, and then we'll get to them at the very end, okay? So starting off with looking at our core concepts, right? So thinking about what the heck are we even talking about? How can we look at getting through what we're really discussing, right? So a lot of times whenever you hear kind of queerness or queer umbrella, right, there's a lot of language that folks use typically around using an umbrella, a spectrum, right? And so queer itself is meant to be this umbrella term, right, that encompasses both sexual orientations and gender identities, right? So that's why the title of the talk today is queerness, right? Because we're talking about all things queer today. Um, and so when we look at it, you might see things like an umbrella of queerness, an umbrella of transness, an umbrella of X, Y, and Z, right? And I'll show you plenty of umbrellas throughout our time together today. So what you might see again is this queer umbrella, which includes both sexual orientations and gender identities, right? So a lot of times when people see LGBTQIA+, right, there's a lot of kind of confusion that what are we talking about, right? Because it's mostly assumed that LGBTQ is a sexual orientation, right? But this is actually not true, right? The T is for trans, and that also is another umbrella, right, which stands for a lot of different gender identities. Further from this, within the transgender umbrella, there are even sub-umbrellas that folks have said, and even within like the concept of umbrellas being like everything's underneath it, some folks would even say that the non-binary umbrella should be kind of like partially not covered by the transgender umbrella, right? And so again, we're trying to create just sort of this grounding concept for us to be able to have language to sort through this nuance, right? And so that's where we're starting today. So it's a lot of tangled concepts in here when we talk about LGBTQIA++, right? A lot of issues that folks see with understanding what is under this umbrella. What are these assumptions that are built into here? And what are we even talking about, right? So within these sort of concepts that we're already beginning to kind of untangle, there's issues of what is sex, right? What's the difference between sex and sexuality, right? What's gender and what's a gender identity versus gender expression, right? And so all of these things are tangled together. We're going to start trying to piece and pull out um, these issues once at a time so that we can really take a good look at them and get an understanding from a non-colonial perspective, right? So starting off, people generally conflate sex assigned at birth with gender, right? So sex is a label. It's male, female, or intersex, right? Which intersex is often completely left out of a conversation altogether, right? And so sex is essentially a label that you're assigned by a doctor at birth, right? Based on the genitals that you're born with and or the chromosomes or hormones that you have, right? So some folks will refer to this as your birth sex, your natal sex, your biological sex, right? Um, Other examples include like assigned female at birth, right? AFAB, or assigned male at birth, right? Which is AMAB. But again, we're not saying that this is how you are assigned your gender or sexuality, right? We're saying that this is where most people start the conflation of gender and sexuality, right? And so it's not valid to use biology or science, right, to say that your assigned sex at birth is fixed, right? There is no concrete concept of like who you are, right? And so just because someone's sexual or reproductive anatomy doesn't fit with this sort of typical definition of male or female, they're typically described as intersex, right? And so more often than not, it's actually decided for them, right? The doctors will decide that like literally with a newborn and kind of make that surgical adjustment to make their physical genitalia align with whatever they're looking for. And um, this is essentially more of what it looks like, right? Which there are a million more combinations that we know of. And so folks that again have multiple chromosomes, are missing a chromosome, right? All of these sorts of things, it's a lot more common than folks would think. And so we're saying that even just assigning sex of male or female at birth, you're already excluding a whole population of folks, right? So moving on to saying that, well, then what is gender if it's not your sex assigned at birth? Well, actually, gender is often really conflated with your biological sex, but again, gender is a social construction, right? All of these things that we're talking about today are constructed, they're created, right? That means that we decide what has meaning, we decide what the meanings are. And so a lot of times we're taught that this is the one way to think about things, and we're saying, no, it's not, right? We're giving you the tools to really kind of interrogate that and sort of sort through that yourselves, right? So gender itself is actually like a social and legal status, right? There's a set of expectations from society, again, for that construction about how people are supposed to behave, what characteristics they might have, how they think about the world, right? And so it's meant to be less about the physical body parts that you have or don't have, right? And more about how you're expected to act because of your sex, right? So we can't talk about gender without talking about gender roles, right? What does that mean to be a man, right? What are men supposed to act like? What are men supposed to look like? And then what is a woman supposed to look like, right? How are women supposed to behave and dress, right? And so again, whenever we kind of start to talk about, umbrellas and spectrums, there's typically this sort of false notion of the spectrum, of the gender spectrum, right? Which usually still ends in a binary of you're either male or female, right? Um, or somewhere in the middle, but that still kind of splits our discussion, right? And so we're saying we need to move beyond this sort of binary idea of gender, and even the idea that gender is on a spectrum. Spectrums continue on in either direction, right? There's no beginning or end point because then it would be like a line, right? And so male is not on one end of the spectrum and female on the other end. Like it's truly a spectrum, a continuum. Um, and so we need to start thinking about how are we representing gender? How are we being open to gender identity and expression beyond this sort of binary idea? So getting into how gender is expressed and internalized, right? We need to sort of sort through the differences in what is gender identity and what is gender expression, right? So essentially, if you need just a quick reminder, right? Gender identity is our internal thoughts about ourselves, right? That's how I feel about my gender, right? Gender expression is the external version of that, right? How I express myself and how I express my gender. Okay. And so these sort of social constructed ideas of being masculine or feminine are not meant to perfectly map onto the biological characteristics of male or female, right? So just because they're parallel, don't think that you have to, kind of match up with each of these, right? And so expression can be a lot of different things, right? That can be through our clothing, through our behavior, through our personal appearance, right? There are a lot of examples and terms along here, and we're not meant to focus on the terms here. We're really looking on getting a better idea of how all these concepts relate to one another, right? So gender identity can really be thought of based off of how folks align with their sex at birth, right? So a cisgender person is essentially a person whose gender identity aligns with their assigned sex at birth, right? A transgender person is really, and again, umbrella, we're getting back to our umbrella terms. Transgender is an umbrella term. There's not one way to be trans or to look trans, right? Um, but that is meant to be an umbrella term for people whose gender identity is different from the one that they were associated with their sex at birth, right? And so there's a lot of there's a lot in there, right? Because we talked about intersex, we talked about non-binary folks, we talked about all of the sort of other terms that existed underneath the umbrella with the umbrella, right? Some people might describe themselves as not on the spectrum at all, right? As non-binary, which is again another umbrella term. It's not one fixed way to look non-binary, right? And so non-binary is someone whose gender identity isn't exclusively male or female, and it may include both or it may include neither, right? They might be totally not on the spectrum at all, right? And that's not for us to know or understand. That's for that person and how they feel about themselves and wish to express that to the world, right? Other identities that are also on the spectrum include being gender fluid, right? And so again, these are not supposed to be like, oh, I'm perfectly in the middle, so I'm gender fluid, right? It's just like, again, the spectrum, and there's arrows in other directions because it continues on, right? So a gender fluid person describes their gender identity as varying over time. Folks may describe themselves as agender, right, without gender. Some folks would also group that underneath the non-binary group, right? It's up to them, right? Again, there are folks that identify as discovering, right? Like who decides that we have to, declare who we are and stay with that forever, right? So again, what we're trying to do is see that basically all we need to know from this is that gender identity is how we feel internally. Gender expression is how we express that into the world, right? Through things that people can see, like our clothing, our behavior, and those sorts of things, right? But again, we're adding more nuance as we go along, right? So just because we are assigned a certain sex at birth does not decide who we are. Um, just because we identify as a certain gender doesn't mean that it's certainly expressed in that certain manner, right? Um, and just because we have a specific gender identity or expression does not inherently determine what our sexual orientation is, right? So the sexual orientation is essentially what most folks I think assume is queer, right? They're like, oh, they're talking about sexuality and all of the sorts of homophobia that comes with that, right? But sexual orientation at its most like baseline understanding is that like the who part of defining your sexual preferences, right? Who are you in terms of choosing a sexual character partner, right? Um, so if you're attracted to one gender, right, that's considered um, there are two possibilities, right? You can be attracted to people of the same gender, which is also known as homosexual, queer, right? If you're attracted to the opposite gender, you could be considered heterosexual or straight, right? However, if you're attracted to both male and female genders, that's where we get to bisexuality, right? Which again, there are multiple stops along this spectrum, right? Um, Attracted to many gender identities is known as polysexual. And then all gender identities is also pansexual, right? But there are so many more that are across the spectrum, right? Um, there's omnisexual, which is attraction to any gender, right? And gender is kind of playing a primary role. But pansexual is more of like attraction to any gender, but gender is really not playing a primary role in that attraction, right? Even looking at the asexual spectrum, right? Ace, that's kind of a lack of or limited sexual attraction to any gender, right? But that can include a lot of different sort of perspectives as well, right? So some folks will put demisexual underneath here, right? That sexual attraction is only felt under specific circumstances, right? And it's really more relationally based. Some people would refer to this as gray sexual, right? A rare or limited sexual attraction to any gender. And then asexual itself, right, is sexual attraction is not experienced towards any gender, right? Um, Other terms include ace flux, right, which identity shifts along that sort of asexuality spectrum. But again, we're not really focused on identifying every single stop along the spectrum. Again, that's not for us to know. It's really about like this is distinguishing from sex at birth, from gender identity and expression, and looking at sexual orientation. And so now that we've sort of pieced through some of these things, we also have to talk about the larger picture that sexual orientation is only one part of sexuality, right? So if we're talking about gender and sexuality, sexual orientation is just one of these many kind of conceptions about the what and the how, right? The what that we enjoy sexually and how we enjoy this practice, right? And so sexuality essentially leads to the sexual habits that we would have, the sexual desires that we have, right? And all of this is not defined by who you have sex with, it's how you feel sexually, right? And so we as individuals get to choose what our sexual preferences are in terms of our sexual partners, right? So starting off looking at, our anatomy, that's our body, right? That's how we feel about our bodies, right? Sexual orientation, like we just talked about, is who we're attracted to. Gender identity and expression, right? How we feel about our gender internally and how that's expressed externally, right? Our relationships, right? How do we show care? How do we care for one another and the folks that we are in community with, right? Body image, how do we feel about ourselves, right? Pleasure, what feels good? Sexual behavior and activity, the actual actions, right? What do you do? And then our sexual and reproductive health, right? Our health and wellness. And so all of these things, we could literally spend the next hour on just one of these, right? Um, but this is really trying to get us to see that there's a way more kind of factors that looking at sexuality encompasses rather than, oh, you were born as a male and you're attracted to the same sex, so you're queer, the end, right? No, right? We're saying that your sex can be assigned at birth and that can be fit for you or cannot fit for you, right? You can have the perceived gender by the world, but you can feel internally one way and express it another way, right? You can be attracted to multiple genders, to no genders, to any gender, right? And that in itself is another kind of piece of the conversation, which all leads us back to looking at sexuality as a holistic perspective, right? And so there's a lot of different ways to put this all together, right? So here in the middle is our person, right? But then look, again, these are spectrums with arrows going off in opposite directions, right? And so it's really difficult to say, like, oh, well, I was assigned male at birth and I am attracted to women, but I also present very androgynously. And, internally, I do feel gender fluid, right? Like, there's no one way to, like, okay, you're here and here and here, and then we perfectly map you onto this one thing, right? And I think a lot of folks think that that's kind of the point of understanding gender and sexuality is to be able to label people and put them in little squares. That's not what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to say that we need to be more expansive in the ways that we think about things, let people be who they are, express themselves how they want to, and that's just for them to know, right? That's just for them. So other ways we can look at this, um, again, sex, gender, sexuality, but then all of these other axes along here, right? So we looked at genetically, chromosomes, those sorts of things, male and female variations and intersex, right? Gender being your identity and the expression, right? And again, these don't have to go together, right? Like I could have a gender identity as a woman, but also express very masculine, right? Like that's up to me. I'm obviously very femme, but um but then same with sexuality, right? Like I could be attracted to multiple sexualities, multiple genders of folks, right? I could be attracted to, but I could behave in a different way, right? This is why research also gets things really wrong, right? Because they normally just ask like, what do you identify as, male, female, other, usually, right? And then who do you have sex with or who are you attracted to? Um, and they're missing, right, like all of these other axes. And that's why a lot of harmful work has been done, right, by looking at gender and sexuality really in a flat manner, right, rather than allowing for these true expansive spectrum sort of representations. So while we're speaking of harm, let's go ahead and get into the sort of colonial impact that we know has happened, right? So we can't sit here without, as an Indigenous person in an Indigenous organization, right? We can't talk about, gender and sexuality without explicitly mentioning the role that colonialism had on interrupting our traditional ways of knowing and being, right? So pre-contact, right? Pre-colonial interruption, right? Um, we have a long-standing histories of acceptance, right? If you look across several Native nations, there are a lot of traditional teachings and intergenerational wisdom that are not grounded in these sort of settler ideas about what it means to have a gender or to express a gender in a certain way or to hold a certain sexuality, right? So a lot of times gender within Native nations was not based off of biology, right? Like not sex assigned at birth. And it wasn't assigned by gender either, right? It was about culture, right? So it was about what is your cultural obligation? What are the roles that you have, right? Um, and that's obviously very nation specific, right? Like in my tribe, my great grandfather was our camp crier, right? And he was a traditional, like, sacred arrow keeper and traditional medicine man, right? That was his role, right? That mattered way more than his gender or his sexuality, right? Because that's culturally congruent. Um, and so there are so many traditions of gender variability and how these have been interpreted over time, right? And unfortunately, right, based off of what we see within kind of mainstream colonial society, it would have you believe that our Indigenous perspectives and presentations, expressions of gender and sexuality are inherently deviant, right? Or that they're against Christianity conceptions of what that's supposed to look like, right? So there are really a lot of different normative behavior patterns, taking women, for example, right, that are not necessarily in contrast to their gender roles, right? So a lot of us didn't have these really rigid, idealized versions of what women are supposed to behave like, right? Um, Women could assume male roles permanently, they could even marry other women, right? And so couple of key examples of this would be the warrior women of the plains, right? They notoriously were along war parties, right, and received war honors. So it wasn't like they were supposed to, be doing something separately altogether, right? And so here on the left, you can see Cheyenne warrior Buffalo Calf Road woman, excuse me, and she fought in a number of battles in leadership roles, right? She was actually at the Battle of Little Bighorn where we killed Custer, right? And it said that she actually charged at Custer, grabbed his saber, knocked him off of his horse, and she was the one that helped kill him along with the others, right? And afterwards, Cheyenne and Arapaho women stabbed their sewing awls into his ears, chanting that you will listen to our people in the next world. They were avenged, right? And it's like thinking about the contrast of that, like warrior women versus what mainstream society tells us how women are supposed to behave today, right? Way different, right? Um, I remember growing up, my mom would always tell us, like, we were warriors, right? Like, there wasn't a Disney princess household for us. She was like, we were warriors. So, like, that's right. That's absolutely right. Also on the right is the Arapaho chief Pretty Nose. She was also in that fight. She was there. She lived to be 101 years old, and her grandson actually served in the Korean War as a U.S. Marine, right? Which again talks about legacies of Indigenous resistance, and that's a whole other conversation, right? But he was later an Arapaho chief, just like his grandmother, right? And so again, these are huge leadership roles that are culturally bound, right? And that's what it's for, right? So it has nothing to do with gender or sexuality or being prescribed, right? It's really about what is best for our nation, right? And how are we acting within the best interest of our people, right? So, sexual orientation is more than just a gender identification. Your gender identity does not mandate who you are sexually attracted to, right? Um, our sexuality as Indigenous people is not embedded in gender ideology, right? And again, sexuality is not a prime marker for identity, right? Oftentimes folks identify as Indigenous first, right? So like for me, I identify as Indigiqueer, saying that like both of my indigeneity and my queerness are necessary to understand how I've moved through the world, how I see the world. Um, but you can't have one without the other, right? And we'll get into more of that duality in just a second. But oftentimes, these sort of like pressed upon us, these gender roles, these sexual orientations are really false conceptualizations for Native people, right? They don't fit with us. That's why a lot of folks are creating our own terms because what has been kind of impressed upon us doesn't fit, right? And again, this sort of dichotomous categorical thinking, either or, yes, yes or no, black or white, right? Male, female, again, that's a really European colonial way of thinking, right? Um, as Indigenous people, we have that sort of relational collectivist approach, right? Thinking about our collective well-being and how we're all doing as a community rather than saying like I'm an individual, you're an individual, we'll all, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? So getting more into sort of how colonizers think about things, right? We really have to talk about this white Western colonial logic, right? So I mentioned it earlier, but we're not trying to assign people to boxes. We're not trying to sort people into categories. But that's very much white Western colonial logic, right? So again, I mentioned that, colonial ways of thinking rendered Indigenous genders and sexualities as deviant, almost criminal, right? They were disparaging, they were just really harmful, right? And so within this sort of way of thinking, right, you inherently get binaries, categories, measurement differences, looking at are they male or female, right? They really conflated gender and sexuality as well, saying if you're a man, you're supposed to be attracted to women. If you're a woman, you're supposed to be attracted to men, right? And so that's what we call compulsory heterosexuality, right? To say that by nature, right, according to colonizer logic, like this is how things are supposed to go, right? And so, as Indigenous people, we were really targeted by colonizers who used their violence and ridicule to enforce this sort of conformity to these colonial norms, right? So, we can see actors like Indian agents, boarding school teachers, missionaries, right? Lots of folks that are really using these colonial tools to enforce what they perceived as what we're supposed to be acting like, right? So all of these like logics, heteronormativity, and Christianity, they all work together in order to justify colonial actions, right? Um, so they're saying that, Native people are inferior, right? We don't know how to act. Their women don't know how to act, right? All these sorts of things. And that also at the same time pathologizing queer populations, right? So there's a long history of queer populations being criminalized, being placed into insane asylums, right? Um, and really used to sort of remove us from the sort of mainstream society. So heteronormativity itself is that kind of worldview, right? Of saying that like heterosexuality is the normative pattern and everything else is then deviant in response to that, right? And so heterosexism is this assumed superiority of like folks who are heterosexual are inherently like that's the right way to be and everything else is wrong, right? And so we can't talk about colonization without talking about the impact of Christianity, right? And the really huge notions that we get of like shame, condemnation, right? Guilt, all of these sorts of things. So that really complicates our present day relationship to thinking about expansive views of sexuality and gender, right? Because it's really hard to sort of sort through all of that guilt and shame and like, you're not normal, you're ill, you're sick, you're wrong, right? There's a lot that's really embedded into that, and there's a lot of work that queer folks and Indigenous folks have to do in order to sort of peel back those layers and get to like, no, this is actually a culturally appropriate way for me to be, right? This is actually how our nation thought about this prior to colonizers telling us how to think about it, right? And so where we get to today is a sort of compound colonialism, right? So the sort of wonderful, awful intersection of racism, homophobia, queerphobia, transphobia, right? So it's kind of like heteronormativity and colonization really like joined forces to say that you can't really be yourself anywhere, right? So queer folks of color, right, Indigenous folks, Black, brown, queer folks experience homophobia within our racial and ethnic communities, right? Typically because of that colonial impact, right? And so like in Indigenous communities, some folks will say like queerness is a white thing, right? Like that's not for us. Because what you see in mainstream society is predominantly white queers, right? So reclaiming that to say, no, we actually have our own traditional ways of knowing and being that are not mapped onto whiteness, right? Or colonialism. And then also the opposite happens as well. Whenever queer folks of color try to be in queer spaces, right, then we can experience racism in those spaces, right? To say like, how can I get, how can I ever be my full self anywhere, right? Because I can either be with Native folks and experience homophobia, or I can be with queer folks and experience racism, right? Like, kind of pick which one you want to do. And so there's really a lack of full inclusion in either space. And oftentimes, what we see is folks are like, oh, well, there's the LGBTQ acronym. Let's just add the 2S on it so that folks will be like, yeah, that's more inclusive, right? We're going to say you can be LGBTQ 2S plus, right? And then that'll make it more inclusive, right? But folks are really not doing that sort of inner work and structural work too to really address those sort of interlocking underlying systems of oppression, right? And so what we're saying is that first off, we have to give people the language to say that no, these are all actually very separate concepts and they can all look a lot of different ways. Two, naming the impact of colonialism and how we're working to disrupt that in the present day society, right? And then three, working on reclaiming and moving towards what does that look like to kind of queer colonialism, right? Or to queer gender and sexuality, right? From an Indigenous perspective. So let's look at how some folks are going about this for emerging avenues, right? So you might hear folks talk about decolonization, right? So for naming colonialism, we obviously need to address it and undo it, right? So decolonizing is just essentially the undoing of colonialism, right? That can look a lot of different ways, right? There's macro, like societal level decolonization, which essentially ends with the dismantling of harmful structures, right? There's micro level internal decolonization that I can do, like neuro decolonization, right? Dr. Michael Yellowbird talks about the kind of inner work that we can do to combine mindfulness and decolonization to really start within ourselves and think about unlearning these sort of internal colonial monologues that we have within ourselves, right? At a societal level, we can reclaim our Indigenous ways of knowing and being, right? To say that actually, no, that is a colonizer concept. That doesn't fit with me. That's not our way, right? And so another parallel that we have with decolonization is looking at queering, right? Or queer theory, right? So to queer something is really to deconstruct something, right? So the queer umbrella is really like a term for a lot of these non-normative, right, sexual and gender identities, right? It was previously a pejorative term, right? It was like not nice, but it was actually reclaimed in the 60s and 70s through the queer liberation movement, right? And so now queer is a term that's meant to be self-affirming and inclusive, right? To say like we're queering settler colonialism, we're queering society, right? By existing and being our full selves, right? So if we were looking to queer settler colonialism, right? We would really render these sort of Western colonial ideas as abnormal, right? To say that that's not the normal. We are the normal, right? How we emerge and move through the world, that's what's normal, right? Imposing a gender binary, using the federal government to enforce that, right? Like if gender is so natural, like why does it need a federal government to enforce it, right? Like just thoughts, right? Naming this disconnect, right, between gender, sexuality, what colonizers would have us believe, right? And then really making these differences visible in order to challenge this legitimacy and applicability, right? So all of the examples that we've talked about, other ideas that you have from your own nation or your own cultural backgrounds, traditions about how did gender and sexuality get expressed, right? What were we taught? What were our ways of doing that prior to colonizers telling us what to do and how to think, right? And so naming and reclaiming queer genders and sexualities, right, is one of those ways that we can do that to say that this is not the norm, right? Heterosexuality is not like how we all come out of the womb, right? And then intentionally centering Indigenous queer folks as leaders and disrupting these sort of settler logics of desire, embodiment, and kinship, right? To say that, like, look, these are folks that know who they are, where they come from, and where they want to go, right? Um, so Indigiqueer, Two-Spirit voices to the front, right? So how can we actually put these things together, right? To decolonize queering, right? To really kind of weave these two things together. There are kind of four main avenues I want us to kind of wrestle with or be exposed to in our time together today. So thinking about how can we unsettle colonial logics, right? So I talked about the sort of measurement, the categories, the either or, right? By unsettling colonial logics, we can take a both and approach, right? To disrupt this sort of colonial dichotomy. Um, so, for example, looking at Two-Spirit folks, right? Two-Spirit is not meant to just be like an Indigenous version of trans, right? It's not necessarily queer folks are inherently Two-Spirit, right? It's more of, again, a role, right? An identity based in culture. So, some nations have specific terms for what they would refer to as Two-Spirit, right? Again, it's not meant for us to understand or prescribe or define. It's really for folks from that nation to name and reclaim themselves, right? So it's not necessarily like I can be a male some days and female other days, right? Like that's not what we're trying to do. We're saying that it can be both and, right? It can be both a gender identity and it can also be a sexual orientation, a gender expression, right? A cultural role, a spiritual role even, right? And so we're saying that we have to move away from understanding these or trying to understand these things through these sort of white supremacist logic and systems, right? We really need that relational way of being in order for these things to even make sense, right? Um, Secondly, we have to disrupt settler temporality, right? So that means just pushing back on settler notions of time, right? Um, Temporal kinship, like being in relationship with one another, centers belonging and accountability, right? So the harms that we cause, the way that we move through the world is essentially centered around our collective well-being, right? And so our sort of present day queer Native perspectives really challenge those sorts of colonial understandings that are rooted in white, queer, and trans life experiences, right? So a lot of our sort of understanding of what queerness looks like is really grounded in the sort of like white middle class experience. And we're saying that like that timeline might not match up for us, right? And so what does it mean to have an expansive view of time, right? To move in and out, right? There's a common conception about walking in two worlds, right? Like we're simultaneously in the past and the present. And also our seventh generations principle, right? Like we're supposed to be doing things that are for the next seven generations, right? And so we're not just thinking about past, present, future, linear time, right? Like we're moving in and out all the time, right? And so queering settler time, right? Um, upset some folks, but I obviously enjoy that. Thinking about our embodied resistance, right? So it's not just a thought exercise. Decolonization is really active, like our embodiment of indigeneity, right? Like me right now, right? Like I'm queer as fuck, right? I'm indigenous as fuck. Oh, sorry for cussing. But our resistance to colonialism is largely unseen in queer spaces, right? It's really it's a white space, right? Queer spaces are typically white. Um, if we are seen, it's kind of ignored or rendered invisible, or we're only brought out like for certain events, right? And so folks really need to understand what does that mean to embody my resistance, right? How am I actively making space and, moving these sort of perspectives towards meaningful belonging and inclusion, right? And then lastly, just thinking about the concept of coming in, right? So it's kind of a countermeasure or another perspective, right, to coming out, right? So it pushes back on those like hegemonic narratives of like knowing who gets to know, right? Um, so some folks are like, when did you come out as straight, right? Like to say that why is it on queer folks to come out as queer or trans, right? But straight folks are never asked to come out, right? But it's not quite enough, right? Because what about the idea of coming in or returning to our own selves, right? And so coming in is really this Indigenous perspective that's like allowing ourselves the space to get to know our own gender and our own sexuality separate from these sort of Western conceptions, right? Or these impositions from colonizers, right? The saying that like we want to come in to ourselves. We want to come home to ourselves and our nations rather than out to the West, right? And so it's how we can tell our own stories, how we can make our own testimonies of what justice looks like for us, and how we can fully be our whole full selves, right? And so all of these things together really work towards like what would a decolonial perspective of queering look like beyond just like adding the two S, right? And so while we're at 2S, let's go ahead and talk about Two-Spirit folks as the resistance is praxis, right? To say that like Two-Spirit identity existence really is resistance, right? So Two-Spirit was created at this third annual spiritual gathering around the 1990s, right? Um, it originates from a Northern Algonquin term that literally means two spirits, right? Including both masculine and feminine spirits in one individual. And so that in and of itself is also pushing back because folks think that it means your male and female gender, right? Rather than masculine and feminine, which are again identity and expression terms, right? So two-spirit, again, back to our umbrellas, is really an umbrella term, right, for Indigenous queer identities, culturally specific expressions of gender and sexuality, right? So it's becoming more and more like a pan-Indigenous or urban collective term, right? Um, and again, like I said, certain nations have their own terms and their own languages, right? And so it's not by any means prescriptive of like, oh yeah, if you're queer and you're native, you're a two-spirit, right? Um, that's not what we're saying at all. So what we are looking at is that it's a wide range of like gender and sexualities across Native nations, right? And research by and from Two-Spirit folks has shown that like it's really more of a spiritual or a social identity. And it's rather, it's specific, right? And so it's not more of like a cultural gender or sexual identity, right? It's really seen as more of like a spiritual role, right? Or a social role within Native nations. So historically, Two-Spirit folks were really highly valued, revered, and respected, right? Which makes sense with it being more of a spiritual identity to understand that like Two-Spirit folks held special roles, right? Like they were healers or teachers, they were in charge of childcare, spiritual leadership, um, or even traditional knowledge keepers, right? And so understanding that a lot of times Indigenous gender and sexuality, right? These were described in relation to cosmological or ecological shifts, right? Which I think is such a beautiful way to understand a spectrum, right? We wouldn't try to just point out one specific place in the universe and say that's where you have to be forever, right? Because we know that seasons are changing and that the world is rotating, right? And that we will see different parts of the sky as we move through time and space, right? And so today, Two Spirit existence is also really just a beautiful representation of what collective resistance to homophobia and sexism look like within colonial society, right? Um, and it's also, I think, a great example of like refusal, right? Refusal to be within a settler category or the sort of flat, you know, representation of like, oh, that's just indigenous queer folks are two-spirit, right? It's like, no, like, and you won't know and you don't need to know, right? There's really great work that I'll talk about on the next slide by Marie Lang, and she's a queer Mohawk scholar and she did all this great work with like urban indigenous two-spirit folks. And her work started off trying to think about like how do two-spirit folks see themselves. And it's really beautiful because they were like, it's not for other people to know, right? Like we know what it is. And like so much of Western research is focused on like translating our experience for them and for their consumption, right? And they were like, we actually want to talk about like us having space to be together as two-spirit folks rather than trying to translate our experience for non-two-spirit folks. And I was like, absolutely, right? Like that's essentially it, right? Um, so they're like interrupting the colonial knowledge over queer indigeneity or over trans indigeneity by really centering their like tribal specific worldviews, right? A lot of Two-Spirit folks are also really icons for language revitalization, right? Because folks are wondering like, what was I like typically referred to in our language, right? Like, what is the word for saying queer, right? Or how I identify, right? And what does that look like without just trying to translate a colonial concept into our language, right? And really getting folks to get back into their language, learn and revitalize that. So again, also decolonizing queering as well. So I know that was a lot of information. We have lots of time to discuss, but most folks are always like, what do I read? How can I learn more, right? And so as a good social worker, I always provide resources. Um, so here on the left, it's A History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt. The middle book is the one I was just referring to by Marie Lang about urban indigenous youth reframing Two-Spirit. And then on the right is Love After the End, an anthology of Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer speculative fiction, which is edited by Joshua Whitehead. And that's with a lot of different, I think the ones on the ends have both have several authors within them. So it's kind of like a collection of articles as well and poems and not articles, but stories. So as we're kind of wrapping up our time and moving into our discussion and Q&A, just wanted to say like it's important for us as Indigenous people, whether you're queer, trans, however you are, if you're an ally, if you're non-native, right? Like how are we working to disrupt the settler nation state, right? And how are we really making space for relatives to be their full selves in our day-to-day life, right? So I always try to end with saying that, you know, decolonization requires all of us because we've all been impacted by colonialism, right? So it's not just for Indigenous people to do. It's not just for, you know, queer folks to do, right? It's for all of us, right? And so what can we do today to work towards a collective project of decolonization, which ultimately should be working towards tribal sovereignty and our collective liberation? Nia-ish. Thank you so much. We shall move into discussion. I will pause and see how we want to do that, Tina.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Blackdeer. Super illuminating. Lots of good stuff there. Lots of good resources to keep studying. In the meantime, though, we do want to engage in some conversation with y'all through the chat. And
Mhm.
so Dr. Blackdeer has developed some questions for us to just chew on and ponder in our own journey as people on this earth. We're going to share a link with you in the chat, breakout questions for yourself. Let's see here. There is a doc in the chat. Thank you, Lala. And go ahead and jump into that. It's the same questions that you see here. And we're going to take some time to answer those in the doc. Go ahead and contribute your own thoughts on your answers to this. Any notes, feel free to pick a nice color that represents yourself. We'll give you some time to do that, and then we'll come back. What's a good time, Dr. Blackdeer? What feels good?
Um, I say about 10 minutes
Beautiful.
for these first two, and then, or do they have access to all four right now, or just two?
All four they have, yeah.
Oh, maybe, well, let's see. Gonna just do five after?
Cool.
I'm back on five
Sounds good.
after. Okay.
Or maybe a little bit earlier. What is the time? Yeah, that sounds good, actually. Yeah, perfect. We'll give you some good time. We'll come back and do some report back, and then we'll do it at the hour, actually. We'll figure it out. Y'all get into it. And yeah, feel free to capture your notes there, and we'll leave you all alone to do that.
Especially when they oops, sorry, especially when they see their queerness as the pinnacle of all oppression, right? And so instead of focusing on addressing the root causes of oppression, which are capitalism and colonialism, right? So definitely, and the second comment also echoes that, starting at the root of their foundations, at the core of themselves, they have to 100% believe that complicity begins with our souls and work from there, right? So definitely some recommendations about starting that inner work before we move on to that sort of external work that we're doing, right? And then lastly, looking at how can we better support queer, trans, and two-spirit members of our own communities. So creating third spaces and providing resources, allowing them space without having to explain why they feel the way they do, right? Inclusive spaces, showing up and being present, supporting events, share space, educating other folks, right? So a lot of really work focusing on having space, right? Having space that folks can truly be themselves, right? Space to heal and talk about their own experiences. Um, and really having people have the opportunity to hear and learn from our experiences as queer Indigenous folks, right? Love that. And being in community with people that also want to challenge these traditional gender roles in their communities and cultures. And I just wanted to take a quick look at the chat, right? Someone mentioned the Western medical hegemony, right? Modern cities are simply not designed to be inclusive to non-binary, agender, two-spirit, and trans people, right? Cities will have over 70% of the world's populations living here. But yeah, even, down to literally how society is structured today, right? Looking at what that, how we're even literally building the spaces that we're in. And then lastly, just wanted to highlight one quick question from the Q&A section. And so there was a question that asked, as a student, I'm interested in how public institutions, which are historically rooted in colonial knowledge systems, might practice this framework of decolonizing queering, right? How might we meaningfully apply embodied resistance and disrupt settler temporality within these public knowledge spaces to create more decolonial queer affirming environments? And so I shared that it's really important to start with what we have where we are, right? So the kind of task we're asked to really look at decolonizing an entire university or an institution might seem daunting, right? But where can we influence change with the space that we have where we are, right? So I'm a professor. I have the ability to change the curriculum, right? To mentor students and to advocate for policy to a certain extent with folks that are being higher up than me. But as students, right, we have a lot of power too to kind of create collective community spaces, right? So I asked, what do current queer spaces look like? Or even, is there a queer space to begin with, right? As we've seen a lot of the kind of attacks on higher education, DEI, a lot of these sort of centers for belonging and inclusion are closing, right? So what does it look like for us to create these sort of spaces of inclusion amidst the sort of fascist regime that we're contending with now, right? So how can we decolonize the space? How are we being good relatives to Indigenous kin? And ultimately, how are we working towards collective liberation and tribal sovereignty, right? And so despite what they would like us to think about or to believe about ourselves, we do have power, and we have power to collectively change and influence our environment, right? And so with that, I wanted to hand it back over to Wendy and the team. Niaish, so much for having me. And thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Please continue it on and reach out with further questions or interests, okay?
Yes, let's give it up for Dr. BlackDeer. Per usual, perfection, an amazing job. Give it up, give it up, give it up. All her flowers, please and thank you. Yeah, the chats, the emoticons are real. They're real. Yeah, amazing work, Dr. BlackDeer. Thank you so much for this second in our series of Queerness 101. I think folks really enjoyed it. Per usual, you do an amazing job of laying out, seemingly complicated concepts. I think for me, my biggest takeaway is definitely like staying in our lanes, right? Some stuff is meant for us and some stuff is not meant for us. And that needs to be respected, right? A function of white supremacy, a function of privilege is an entitlement to like knowing the things, wanting to be in everything, being nosy in everybody's business. And it's like, no, 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 back up a little bit, respect kind of scope and lanes, right? And just cultural humility. So, among other things, that was a beautiful takeaway for me. So, shout out one more time for Dr. Blackdeer. Amazing work that she does in scholarship and just being amazing in the world. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Before we go, though, I want to pass it over to our comms team, Lala. And then we're going to have a little exit survey for y'all to let us know how we did and what we could do better and where do we go from here, because that's exciting. Oh yes, important note, Dr. Blackdeer's earrings are by Queer Two-Spirit artist with new Pride earrings dropping soon. Gotta plug the earrings. Come on now. Come on now. So Lala, hit us.
Thank y'all so much. Hello, relatives. I do want to just shine light on our recent campaign that is coming to an end. Specifically, I do want to call on our white comrades and folks with economic privilege. If you are able to donate, that would be amazing. Whatever you can donate. For our community members, I am asking us to share our campaign. Let me drop it on the chat so y'all have it. This campaign is our 100 days watch campaign, where we have been tracking everything that this administration has been doing, from the attacks on doubling down on fossil fuel to attacks on our migrant community. We have been also sharing tangible steps that we can do to protect ourselves, our community members, and Mother Earth. And our commitment is that beyond this, we will continue to fight for Indigenous sovereignty by organizing, investing, and protecting what is sacred. So we are asking on our community to help us deepen our work by sharing with your folks on social media. And like I said, if you are a white comrade, if you have economic privilege, please donate whatever you can. That helps us deepen this work that is very important, not just for Indigenous folks, but for everybody else, because we all live on our Mother Earth. So thank y'all so much for listening, and thank you for sharing in advance.
Awesome. Lala from our comms team. You'll see her around on the interwebs doing amazing content, amazing work for us and interfacing with our community. Yeah, do your thing, Dr. Blackdeer. Once again, let's give it up for her. Superstar out here. Yes, queen. Get it, get it, get it, get it. Amazing. Have a beautiful day. Thank you so much. And then lastly, folks, we want to hear from you. Thank you for considering donating, by the way. We appreciate so much. If it's within your capacity, we would love some love. But we're mainly looking to our folks with resources and with some privilege. So please keep that in mind. If you don't have that, then definitely share in the interwebs, share in the social media realms, please. And then lastly, I'm going to share with you our survey. Please go ahead and fill that out for us. Let us know how we did today, what you want to see more of, what you didn't like, yeah, where we could improve, everything. We want to hear all of it, good, bad, ugly, all of it. We're always looking to evolve. We're always looking to do a better job. Shout out, once you've done that, be on your way, or if you need to do it later, be on your way. Shout out to my amazing team, IT, Anna Rivera, give it up. Shout out to Lala, our comms team, our entire comms team. V, Steph, Lala, give it up, give it up, give it up. Yes. So, everybody have a beautiful day. Thank you so much for being here. Have a beautiful rest of the week and go forth and remain ungovernable. Take care.